the project manager and also the manager of the Ciprian Theatre in Buzău, the leader of the project. Next, I will move on to Mr. Kivu, who is the project sociologist. We have the team from Portugal as well, Adelaide Pacheco, who is the project manager for Portugal. Eduardo Ribeiro, the artistic director in Portugal. Of course, our friend and co-director of the performance, I.L.Caragiale, the artistic director from Spain. And of course, the Romanian team, Professor Ion Miceagă, a dear friend of mine and a muscle, and a co-director and co-playwright of the Planet of Lost Dreams. Of course, Andrea Darie, the actor who plays the role of the child left behind, we'll see. And Radu Solcanu, actor in the performance in Romania. And last but not least, Gabriel Sandu, whom some of you have already met, who is the project PR. It's a partnership between the Ciprian Theatre in Buzău, the project leader, and the Catholic University San Antonio of Murcia, and also the Municipality of Lousada in Portugal. The project aimed to explore migration between Romania, Spain, and Portugal. Because Romania has a negative migration, 3.6 million people are living and working abroad, and lots of people work in Spain. Over 600,000 Romanians work in Spain. Portugal has also had a negative migration, as Mr. Kivu will tell you later, and lots of people went abroad to work in Spain. So this is the social context that we explored. The project had different phases. First, we took interviews of migrants in Spain, and left behind families in Romania, and left behind families in Portugal. Each project team did those interviews. These were then transformed into a script for a telematic theatre performance between Romania and Spain, and in 5 short films in 360 degrees created by Municipio de Lousada, actually commissioned by them. Of course, the project has a research side, which we are going to delve deeper into in a few moments, and also a dissemination part, because we held conferences and workshops in the universities in Romania, and Spain, and Portugal. Also workshops that were telematic. So we had students in Romania working with students in Spain, or students in Romania working with students in Portugal, online. And this is the final phase of the project. So what were the research questions? On the one hand, we wanted to see how telepresence functions in the theatre from a dramaturgical point of view. Then we explored the sense of presence in cinematic virtual reality, meaning the 360 degrees films. And of course, the sociological side of the project about migration and internet-family relationships. We employed a practice as research methodology. It was the framework that inspired the project. We, of course, as methods, we documented the activities, and we employed audience questionnaires for both the telematic performance and the art films. So I will actually focus on those questionnaires today, and we'll start reading from time to time. So I will go over the highlights of the project results. Most of my presentation will refer to the Planet of Lost Dreams telematic theatre performance, and in the end we'll talk about the films as well. You can find a detailed study of both in the Tele-Encounters volume that you have received. In the case of the telematic performance, we will analyze it from a dramaturgical point of view, while the films will be discussed from the point of view of the sensation of presence. What was my role in the project? I conceived the project and ensured its artistic management throughout. In collaboration with UNATC, I co-wrote the play and co-directed the telematic theater performance. During rehearsals, apart from more traditional theater directing, I also had to do the live video montage. You'll see that we had a live montage of images from Spain and Romania meeting on screen. Good. So what about telepresence? We started with a broad definition of the term, meaning that we employed it to refer to any technologically mediated experience that enables a sense of being there. However, the project has led us to redraft the definition and employ telepresence only in specific cases. For this, we did research on the broader area of telepresence, and we could group the existing definitions into three. On the one hand, we have telepresence as real-time teleaction in a remote physical environment. This is the definition introduced actually by Marvin Minsky, who coined the term in 1980 to refer to the field of telerobotics. There's also telepresence in the broader sense of remote reconstruction of ourselves. This is a definition used by Roy Ascott to describe telepresence in the broader field of telematics. And later there was the sensation of being there during a mediated experience, accompanied by the illusion of non-mediation. So this is the broadest definition of all, because it's associated to fields such as VR, television, and even popular media. So let's first analyze telepresence in telematic theater. So telematics. In a theater context, I will define telepresence as a real-time relationship enabled by telematic technologies between remote bodies, objects, and spaces, which can take the form of visual communication, meaning any visual information transmitted from one side to the other, including text or emoticons. Also auditory action, so not only the actor's words, but all the auditory information transmitted from between the two spaces, and also physical action. So I trust this definition of telepresence better suits the theater. Firstly, the actors' exchange during the performance can take multiple forms. It can be verbal, non-verbal, verbal, gestural, so a blink of the eye can convey more information than a handshake. This means that we shouldn't necessarily favor physical actions happening remotely over other forms of audiovisual communication as a way of affecting the remote environment and the people in it. So we extended the definition of teleaction. Teleaction is also visual, physical, and auditory. Secondly, is remote action in a virtual environment any different from action in a physical environment in the theater? Maybe not when it comes to the sensation of being there. However, some theorists and practitioners draw structural distinctions between being present in a virtual environment and being present in a physical one. For instance, Ken Goldbeck makes a distinction between VR and TR, telereality. VR is simulacral, while TR is distal. This was a quote. So he explicitly states that his concern is not with the physiological or psychological sense of immersion, but with perceptions of fiction and reality. So following Goldbeck's lead, I will maintain that in the Planet of Lost Dreams performance, immersion was not a defining trait of telepresence. However, neither was the distinction between fiction and reality, because dramatic theater, unlike the performative installations of Ken Goldberg, features actors playing characters different from themselves, in fictional circumstances. So dramatic theater is, to a great extent, simulacral, and telepresence in this context is perhaps as fictional as virtual presence. The Kinect-controlled animation scenes in the Planet of Lost Dreams are an example of telepresence in a virtual environment, because they connected to physical spaces. However, the actresses met in a virtual space. On the screen, you saw the Kinect animations. Okay. As shown above, thinking of telepresence in the theater can complicate the conceptual distinctions made by Minsky, Katz, or Goldberg. So I will further refer to the dimensions of telepresence as being representative a determinant of the dramaturgical layers of telematic performance. Okay, back to the presentation. Telepresence indicator. Let's see the setup of the telematic theater performance. So we had two spaces, Romania and Spain. There was a screen in those spaces, a physically present audience in both countries, and actors in both countries. On the projection screen, the audience in each country could see a live montage of images coming both from Romania and from Spain. So, apart from seeing the action happening in the other country on the screen, the audience could also see augmented moments of the physical actor's performance. We employed one smartphone as a communication channel between the characters, which was realistically integrated into the performance. Apart from that, we used a webcam that was extraneous to the performance. The actors didn't interact with it, but it caught general images, wide shots of the space in each country. Apart from that, we had a Kinect device that we employed in non-realistic sequences. We created a shared mother-daughter world where the two actresses, Andreea Darie and Sandra Wancea, mother and daughter, would meet online and actually touch visually. About the dramaturgy of the performance, Eugenio Barba speaks about several layers of dramaturgy, which is not only the writing of the text, as in Romania it is often considered to be, it is a compositional process, dramaturgy. Speaking of the specific dramaturgy of the Planet of Lost Dreams, I would say that the narrative, the space, and the actors themselves are contained by the technological matrix. And as far as the remote action is concerned, all exist through it. So the affordances of the technological matrix determine up to a point the actor's degree of freedom. I agree with Lev Manovic that no interface is neutral. And far from being a transparent window into the data inside the computer, the interface brings with it strong messages of its own. It was a quote. This idea relates to new media dramaturgy, which is also called new materialist dramaturgy. This new strand of dramaturgy foregrounds the importance of the materiality of technology in performance. So in works included under the new media dramaturgy umbrella, the machine is considered autonomous, since the artists have started to listen to it and to liberate it from the constraints of narrative. The use of video projection follows the same rules. It doesn't obey the narrative. But this analysis is placed exclusively in the realm of post-dramatic theater. I find the post-dramatic sphere to be limiting for the understanding of the impact of technology on contemporary performance. In the Planet of Lost Dreams, I think technology does speak because it has a structural role. This type of theater is inconceivable outside of technology, irrespective of it being dramatic or post-dramatic. So telematic theater as a genre is shaped by the theaters, by the technological matrix, and also by the immaterial content. So in a way, the machine and the content are always interlaced, as Lev Manovic says. That is not to say that there is no difference between dramatic theater incorporating technology to serve a predetermined story, such as staging Per Gynt with new technologies, and dramatic theater that is being created from scratch in permanent dialogue with a technological form. So telematic theater belongs to the latter category and should be considered a part of new media dramaturgy. Now, about the audience's dramaturgy. Eugenio Barba describes it as a process of personal interpretation by the audience, but also a process of creating a montage, because in his performances, for instance, actions take place throughout the space, and the audience need to select what to watch at any one point. This was relevant in our case as well, because people could choose to watch the screen or to watch the physical action in front of them. So we tested via questionnaires the audience's relation to migration, their relation to internet communication, and we came up with some, and their attention to the performance. We came up with some interesting conclusions that are not really definite, meaning that they need further testing, but they could be a starting point into further research. So on the one hand, this is the population size that we tested. In Romania we had 306 questionnaires, in Spain 86, which means that the marginal error were slightly larger in Spain. People affected by migration. There was a question that asked them to choose their relation to migration. So we had people with close family members living abroad, people with distant relatives living abroad, ex-migrants, current migrants, people with no connection to migration. However, the percentage of people affected by migration was large in both Romania and Spain. So this goes contrary to our initial assumption that people in Spain would not be affected by migration. They also had relatives living abroad, and they were Spanish nationals. About the factors which influenced the audience's attachment to the characters. Asked, well, this is a tricky question because when translated in Romania and in Spain, the word is not really the same. So we aimed to test empathy. However, in Spain it was more like, do you like that character? While in Spain it was like, do you sympathize with that character? So there was a problem in the translation for this question. That's why I don't know if we can mention, if we can say that the results are extremely relevant for the concept of empathy, which is quite deep. But I think we can talk about the audience's attachment to the characters. Because asked what character they preferred, the audience in Romania chose Betty. The audience in Spain chose Carmen. So this makes us think that there might be some sort of a site-specific bias that leads the audience in one space to empathize more or to like more the characters in their own space, provided that the story supports this. Because as we can see, the character of the father of George, who is an alcoholic, Radu, was the least popular in both countries. But when the story was more balanced, as in the case of the mother and daughter, opinions were divided between Romania and Spain. So this is reflected in the next question as well, because the performance has an open ending. The audience is asked what they think the left-behind daughter should do. And those in Spain thought that it would be better for her to go to Spain, while those in Romania favored another option, live her life as independently as possible. So this might be a question of wider attitudes at play in the two countries. About this, when asked about how their opinion of migration had changed or not as a result of the performance, we came across some really negative comments about migration in Romania against more balanced remarks in Spain. That might be because people in Romania see themselves only as potential immigrants and thus they recognize their situation as being more prone to family disruption, while those in Spain might be more ready to see themselves as both hosts and immigrants. So that's why the opinions might have been more balanced, but this needs to be tested further. The distribution of attention. Initially, we feared that the screen would attract more attention than the audience, than the physical actors, but this didn't really happen. The audience was balanced between the stage and the screen in both Romania and Spain. And actually, on the last place, we can see that the screen attracted the least attention in both countries. This goes contrary to what Philip Auslander says about the screen being prevalent in performances that combine physical actors and virtual presences. Okay. We can see the factors of attention on the audience that influence the audience's attention. Again, questions of content are more significant for the audience's experience, such as the story or the acting. The video quality, the screen dimensions were not that important in attracting their attention. And the same goes for Spain. About the film, do I still have time?
You still have time, yeah.
Okay. So the film exhibition was commissioned by Municipio de Lousada to the Creative Lemons Film Company. First of all, we need to distinguish between cinematic virtual reality and virtual reality. Virtual reality means that you have the liberty to move within the simulated space generated actually by the computer. In CVR, you can't really move. You can simply choose where to watch because it's a predetermined content. It's filmed in 360 degrees. It's not constructed by the computer. The sense of presence. So initially we referred to it as telepresence. However, we have decided to restrain the definition of telepresence because it's too broad to encompass both virtual reality, CVR, and telematic theater. So we refer to the sense of presence as the sensation of being there in the mediated environment of CVR or VR experience. Okay. The sense of presence can be considered similar to immersion. That's what Lombard and Witten tell us. Immersion can be psychological or can be physical. And we asked the audience what they thought about their feeling of immersion. And most of them chose physical immersion, not psychological immersion. And the younger the people, the most powerful the sensation of physical presence was. I will just read the conclusions of this study on audience perception in CVR, if I can find it. Yeah. Okay. So our study of the audience's perception has the opposition between presence itself and the sensation of presence was discussed in the context of migration. So I saw certain modes of presence can, I'm sorry, I'm extremely nervous today. I hope you can understand. It's a very important moment. Okay, in terms of the audience's experience of the five short films, our questionnaires revealed that physical immersion was prevalent over mental or emotional absorption, especially for younger participants, the so-called Z generation, who also reported an overall higher sense of presence than people over 18. We have hypothesized that the potential novelty of the immersive medium might have been responsible for causing the audience to engage more on a physical level than an emotional one. Even so, the sense of presence was not the only way of engaging in the films, because some respondents invoked that the re-embodiment and rescaling were more relevant for them, such as seeing the world from the dimensions of a cup. The main factors that influenced the sense of physical presence was the clarity of the filmed image, the space in which the film was shot, the spatialized sound, and the story. Mental and emotional absorption was supported first of all by the story, followed closely by the clarity of the filmed image, the spatialized sound, the longer time spent in the world of the film, and the first-person point of view. The elements that hindered the sensation of presence were analyzed without a comparison between the different types of immersion. The most significant ones were the film cuts, jumping from one scene to the other, the external sounds coming from the exhibition space, and the lack of clarity about the viewer's role in the story. So these results could indicate that 360-degree film cannot effectively incorporate practices common in classical film, and hence requires new tools. VR and CVR may rely on continuity of experience akin to that of real life, which can be subverted in a controlled fashion as long as this is part of the filmmaker's concept. We have also looked briefly at the concept of empathy in CVR, discussing its relationship to the sense of presence and its possible pitfalls. We have seen how the audience can react against what they perceive as the filmmaker's desire to make them empathize at any cost, causing them to reject the film. Even if limited in scope, this study may inspire further research into CVR that could underpin meaningful artistic experiences and the invention of new vocabularies for 360-degree film. Okay, so I think this is okay. Do I still have time for questions or not?
Yeah, you still have time for questions.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If you want.
If you have any questions.
What was the most exciting moment for you creating this?
There were many moments. Well, perhaps the first time we started rehearsals online, I think that was the most important moment. When we started to communicate with the Spanish team online. Yes.
Could I ask about that communication protocol? Because it seems to me that there's the effort of making everything work and making it work in performance and for the performers, but there's a sort of parallel thing going on, which is how production teams talk to each other. So how did you enable that and resolve that? And was it straightforward or was that problematic?
Well, it was problematic, meaning that technology would always break down. There was parallel communication, of course, happening during the performance. So I and Javier were communicating via WhatsApp constantly, so there was a constant link.
So WhatsApp is your platform for that?
Yeah, WhatsApp was a platform, while the characters, the actors communicated via Google Hangouts in the space of the performance, not outside the performance. So only the technical teams communicated on a parallel channel. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. And was it satisfactory?
I think it was, because luckily enough the internet never failed us. I think so, yes. I mean, we were able to save the performance several times because we could communicate in parallel. Even when one actor didn't do something, or when the telephone lost the image, I could tell Javier, please tell Anna to do this. Yeah. So I think it was satisfactory.
Is there any other question? I'm curious to ask you if on an artistic level you felt that this whole production department that you also kind of had to manage, you felt it was like challenging, like you also feel like you had time in your mind to focus on the artistic side, or you felt like you need always to be in charge of the...
Yeah, I felt I always needed to divide my time between the artistic and the production sides. And I think that might have been a problem. I mean, for instance, in the technological development process, for the next project, I would allow a lot more time to testing, because we started with a certain configuration of the technology and then realized that, well, this doesn't really work. So we changed something in the app and that led to bugs in the application. So actually this hindered the rehearsals. So yes, I would allot separate times for developing each, and also times for coming together and testing technology and the set design and everything with the actors, and then going back to developing them separately.
Did you adapt the story you wrote, the play, for the, let's say, technological challenges you might have faced, or you didn't?
I think technology and the story were born at the same time. In a way. I mean, we knew what technological framework we would employ to tell this particular story, so the adaptations we had to make were minor, such as taking out a character just to make the story shorter. But otherwise, no. I mean, we had technology and the story in mind at the same time while working. And I think, yeah, Mr. Michaga can confirm.
The teatro is literally the place of the audience. So it reminds us that theatre encompasses its audience as much as the stage. As David Wiles suggests, theatre is preeminently a spatial medium, for it can dispense with language on occasion, but never with space. Separately, in his reflection upon what he calls the theatrical situation, Hans Thies Lehmann suggests that a situation of reception arises when the theatre brings people together, normally in a space that is to some degree public. So if this describes the theatre of Dionysus in Athens, it can apply no less to the internet as a site of public dissemination and engagement, or to the multiple places, actual and virtual, of telepresent performance. Lehmann reminds us of the specific medial attributes of theatre. The theatre involves communal experience in the moment. As a performative process, Lehmann observes, theatre exhibits a specific temporality, end quote, which we can describe as presentness, not just being there, but being now. And I think this is, so one of the features that I want to touch on today is that I think telepresence has considered distance and connection bringing spaces together a lot, and I'd like to consider how that operates within a temporal paradigm. So, time, space and event within theatre and also in telepresent performance are coterminous. The space and event are accessed in time experienced in the present. Except that in telepresent performance there's also a plurality of space. But for today's purposes I'm interested in this simultaneity of time. To help us think about this, let's turn to Alice Rayner's Everywhere and Nowhere, Theatre in Cyberspace. Published in 1999, Rayner's essay contains insights that continue to resonate, I think. Her aim, she says, is, and I quote, to explore the emerging conditions of telepresence, so this is nearly 20 years ago now, as a transformation of theatre space, a transformation that supplies an epistemology that does not have its foundation in the languages of space, end quote. On the face of it, this appears to require new conceptions of space and spatiality, given that the prefix tele insists upon, as she says, distance, remoteness, and lack of presence, although it also bears upon temporality. As Rayner suggests, in telepresence, the apparatus alters the placement of bodies and puts them in terms of time, not place. Geometric space is dematerialized through the digital transmissions and rematerialized in the video apparatus, putting place into the order of time, which I think is a really suggestive little nugget. In this case, the degrees of remoteness, the geographical distance of distributed locations and virtual spaces, are arguably less significant than their arrangement in and through time. We might define theatrical presence in Rayner's construction as both a mode of being there, or here, or there, inhabiting a particular place, and a mode of being now, that is, transacting in the present moment. Discussions of time in art usually light upon Henri Bergson's writing on duration and experience, excuse me, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, and this paper is no exception, not least since Bergson's writing, I think, takes on additional resonance in a digital era. Christina Chow gives a useful potted summary. For Bergson, duration is the time that we experience subjectively. It not only entails the perception of the present as it unfolds, but it's also the memory of the past, affecting the experience of the present. Therefore, the present preserves images of the past, while gathering the potential future, both of which coexist virtually with the present. In this sense, duration is both a continuous unity, while also heterogeneous in nature, end quote. This prefigures a digital notion of time, the sort of availability that we now assume through digital distribution, ever-extending chats and timelines, growing digital archives, of an accumulating past held within a reforming present. I'd like to suggest that we can transpose this reading of duration as a kind of layering of past and future into the present, to think of telepresence as a layering of that place and that place, however many places, into this place, and all in an unfolding present, experienced plurally from different places. One further temporal reference, in Walter Benjamin's construction, now-time is conceived not as a shallow concern with the immediate here and now, but a rich engagement with the present moment. De la Durantaye describes it as a conception of time focused on the dynamic instant, rather than on the progressive and normalizing continuum, end quote. This sounds different from a Bergsonian duration, but I'd like to think we can have our cake and eat it and have the two together. In telepresence, I suggest, this now time is emphasized, partly because it's pluralized, time experienced simultaneously in different places, and while place is multiplied, the sense of the present moment is intensified, and this intensification takes place durationally. To flesh this out, or perhaps just sketch a little, I'd like to touch briefly on 3 instances of telepresent performance, and in doing so, consider the position of the audience, which Marina's already touched on in her presentation. Each of these 3 pieces trades in liveness, in now time, but with different viewing arrangements. As we might expect, explorations of digital performance are being undertaken in doctoral practice research theses. Christina Papagiannouli's e-theatre project, 2014, was a PhD project presented as what Christina describes as a cyberformance on the digital platform Upstage, an online environment for collaborative presentation. And Papagiannouli has since published her thesis as a book, Political Cyberformance, the e-theatre project. E-theatre project featured a collage of images, avatars and texts played live by remote participants. The theme of migration was a focal point, which makes this a useful instance perhaps today, with the contributors reflecting upon their own biographies and ideas of belonging and placelessness. There are connections here with game worlds that facilitate a free-flow exchange between participants, although in this instance, Papagiannouli and her collaborators were concerned with developing a texture of shared experiences rather than a dramatic narration. Papagiannouli draws directly on Upstage artist Helen Varley-Jamieson's understanding of cyberformance. Performers and audience are present in the same moment when the performance takes place. The work has usually been prepared and rehearsed beforehand, and while it may contain pre-recorded elements such as audio, video, animation and scripting, these are combined and presented as a performance in real time for a simultaneously present audience. But present here means a particular thing. The audience was present in this project by way of watching online. So the stage is the computer monitor, which gathers the distributed performances and plays it out to its spectators, which is different from the model that Marina introduced. The key feature then is presence understood as liveness, now time. Being in the same time as others, adjacent to performance, guarantees a transmedial togetherness that's oddly familiar. It puts us firmly in the teatron as witnesses to a communal present tense exchange. In Phone Home, 2016, another project as this one, supported by the European Union's Creative Europe programme, Upstart Theatre in London, Pathos, if I pronounce that correctly, in Munich, and Pathos München, I should say, and Highway Productions in Athens, collaborated on a production for simultaneous performance in 3 theatres in Athens, London and Munich, each with a co-present audience. So 3 parallel and simultaneous strands of narration with some live interconnection between the different locations, so dispersed but aligned. Audiences online could choose which location they watched or cut between the 3. As the project's publicity describes, and I quote, "The creators worked with refugee and migrant organisations, connecting with people who found themselves resettling in one of the 3 participating cities, be it their final destination or just another stop along the way to their new home." In his review of this piece for British Theatre Guide, Keith McKenna complained that by chunking the material into 15 scenes, each of around 6 minutes, the production was trapped into presenting a series of vignettes on the topic of migration, rather than developing a more sustained engagement with individual stories and situations. So in his account, I didn't see this piece, but in his account it had more of a sort of glossing effect. And I think this is a challenge in telepresent theatre, not least because so much time is required to make the thing work. Dramatical arrangement of narrative and theme in this sort of seamless presentation, I think, remains challenging. Nonetheless, the point here is to note another model of telepresent performance, a pluralizing of modes of spectatorship in the space and online, to include several spaces in which an audience watches a stage and the prospect of watching remotely. And a final instance, this time of a piece that gathers remote performance for an audience gathered in a single space. Longing for the impossible, for the moment it is real, brackets, longing, ... was presented by the Danish Performing Arts School, Royal College of Music in London, and the Theatre Institute Barcelona at the Royal Danish Academy of Music in Copenhagen in 2017, with digital design and telematic production by Studio Bisco, and was apparently the first public networked performance in Denmark. In the words of the project outline, Longing comprised 5 contemporary compositions which featured a different mix of musicians and dancers in Copenhagen, Barcelona and London. A visual theme of orbiting spheres inspired by the atomic model of Danish physicist Niels Bohr was used to create a networked performance dramaturgy in which the performers, regardless of physical location, were all elements of the same performance space as experienced by the audience. So this piece kind of accumulated all of that remote contribution into this digital design which segments the screen and puts the performers in different parts of the screen in order to play out synchronously for a co-present audience. It's not unusual to see telepresence projects geared around musical and dance-based interactions, although my focus here has been less on aesthetic matters and more on relations between audience, time, and space. In the 3 instances, I think there are 3 different configurations of the presence and co-presence of spectators and performers, but in each of them, presentness, putting place into the order of time, is predominant. In her discussion of telepresence, Chris Paulson retrieves, as she describes, C.S. Peirce's semiotic category of the index. I feel like apologising for going back to semiotics, but never mind. Which designates signs that have an existential relation to the things and events they signify, end quote. So for Peirce, she says, indices put the receiver in a present tense relationship with the referent. Paulson discusses the split temporality of telepresence, time experienced in different places, its disposition to plural arrangements of time, with regard to its semiotic potential. Regardless of when it was produced, she says, the index establishes a forceful present tense connection with its receiver. Here again, an emphasis on the now moment and the presentness of telepresence, aside from whatever it is that the sign the index is referencing. not that we're uninterested in meaning. And this brings us to a few closing comments in relation to migration. So I apologise for this swerve, but I wanted to finish with something that might reverberate with the theme of the symposium. You might argue that my emphasis on temporal rather than spatial aspects is more contingent when we come to migration, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree. But let's consider a few coordinates. Migration is to do with mobility, which is to say travel over time. Its position in relation to place, so to say, is twofold. The migrant inhabits always an other place, and is in part defined by belonging to, or at least travelling from, a different place from the one she is in. A form of embodied displacement is at work. Migration surely always entails a logistical challenge, the business of conducting movement, travel, whether this is forced and rushed or intentional and planned. It's therefore also always work, the hard work of making arrangements and rearrangements, adjustments, accommodations, learning, coping, perhaps even surviving, remaking. This work is also a work of memory, for migration carries its trace, the place that was left, the people in one's past, the shapes of a life lived differently previously. This brings us back to time. Migration is layered in the way that telepresence is layered, a fusion of the past and of potential futures in a lived present, and a layering of the place of departure, places of transit, and an arrived at or intended destination. Technologies of telepresence have the capacity to dissolve space for a time, and that time is itself of the moment, a telepresent moment in which we can be together again now for a duration. Thank you.
Being co-present in time is very significant for the contemporary telematic performance. And I was thinking that indeed, even our performance, they were not co-present in space, obviously. In a way, they were not even co-present in time, because as you said in your article, Transmediating the Tecton, time is also layered. So Spain has a time, Romania has a different time, and there's also a delay over the internet.
Yeah.
So maybe not even space can, not even time is creating a shared element.
I think that's been a holy grail of telematic, telepresent exchange, just effacing latency. And especially working at the levels that theatre companies are used to working at, who don't have the kind of technological oomph of the big broadcasting corporations, latency is much more evident. However, I think the technologies are allowing much closer to real-time communication. So it's it's hard to say, but it feels like this work was in a way in the air 20 years ago, and that now feels like a long time. On the other hand, perhaps is still in its infancy if there is or will be a set of resources available to performance makers that just allow for this really easy transaction in real time. And I think it's that transaction and then working the scenographies and the sort of conceptual spatial interrelation that then is very productive.
Yeah, because I know there are certain experiments, even in the past, in the 1980s, the electronic cafe aimed to, this experiment aimed to bring together artists all over the world and to create fixed venues where artists could meet and interact online, but the technology at that time was not that good to enable that.
Yeah.
But I know there are certain attempts at the present moment even in London, there's a performance created between the theatre in Bristol, I think, and Lambda and the Royal College of Music, and they did a telematic performance. And their intention is to create a distributed network of telematic spaces in universities to enable the coming together of artists all over the world, and they discovered a way to reduce the latency. I think Sylvia will have something to say about that as well. So being present in the now moment might be easier to realize now.
Yeah, it's something I think we are in some ways familiar with through these bigger scale broadcasts. Like think of the World Cup, for instance. Like everyone around the world can watch the World Cup, broadly speaking, in the moment in which it's happening, and then talk to people in Brazil, why not say Brazil, or Italy or wherever, in the same conversation. So I think it's partly to do with the cascade of technological capacities into this more ubiquitous, accessible environment for contemporary performance makers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A very important member of our team. He created the interview guide that we employed when we interviewed migrants in all the 3 countries, and he's also the one who analyzed all the interviews. It was a qualitative analysis.
Okay, let's try putting things into context. Some general characteristics of migrations are, as you know, a universal characteristic of human society. Human societies always migrated since the time of glaciations, since Homo sapiens appeared. Now, when we speak nowadays about migrations, we have to make some distinctions. We speak about individual migration, which usually has economic causes. An individual migration can be permanent, and usually this one implies the whole family, or temporary, cyclic. It means people going abroad for working, and in most of cases, and coming back in their country of origin for a certain period of time, and then leaving again for the same country or for another country, and then coming back again. And this kind of migration usually implies just part of the families. Sometimes it's only the husband or the wife. Sometimes it's both parents leaving the children at home, and so on. We have also collective migrations, which can be caused by wars, by change of climatic condition, and so on. And actually, nowadays, Europe is confronted with important collective migration, mainly caused by war or other human created damages. Well, let's pass into review the differences between the characteristic of migration in the 2 countries that we are focusing on, meaning Portugal and Romania. The Portugal immigration had a transatlantic phase in the 19th century, when approximately 2 million people have emigrated to Brazil mainly, but also to other countries, especially from the poor regions in the north of the country. a second phase of the Portuguese immigration was the European phase in the 50s to the end of the 80s, when for a shorter period of time, a mass of population equivalent to the previous phase. I mean, before we had 2 million people emigrating during almost 1 century, and now we had again about 2 million people emigrating during only 2 decades. And they went maybe mostly in most developed countries of Europe, mainly to France. Then we had in the 80s phase of mixed emigration and immigration. This phase actually led to a better balance inflow and outflow of population. I mean, starting with the 80s, Portugal was both a country of emigration and of immigration. And nowadays, Portugal became a country of net immigration. 2017 was year when the first year where the number of people coming into Portugal was higher than the number of people leaving Portugal. Now let's speak about Romania. Before World War II, the Romanian emigration was not significant. Of course, we had Romanian emigrating to Americas, but not in such an important amount as Portugal or let's say Spain. During the communist regime, Romania was a closed country. The borders of the country were closed. People could not emigrate as on their own. Still, we had immigration allowed by the communist regime on ethnical reasons. I mean, Romania had important communities of Germans and Jewish from historical times, and these communities were allowed to emigrate during the communist regime, and most of them actually did this. To compare the census from 1948 to the one of 1992, meaning before and after the communist regime, the number of Germans decreased living in Romania, decreased for over 300,000 to only 11,000, and the Jewish decreased from more than 400,000 to less than 10,000 after the communist regime. So actually, the immigration during the communist regime led to practical extinctions of the minorities, these minorities in Romania. There was also, during the communist regime, a political immigration. People who emigrated mostly illegally, and in many occasions in dramatical conditions like crossing the Danube, swimming, or crossing the terrestrial frontier illegally, and some people have actually lost their freedom or even their life in such trying to escape. Well, after 1989, the immigration had mainly economic causes. The first phase was between 90 and 95, when the immigration kept the ethnical character, meaning that the remaining Germans and Jewish immigrated. There was an exodus of the remaining German population from Romania. Between 96 and 2000, we had a greater intensity of temporary immigration, mostly illegal, but this time it was not illegal because Romanian borders were closed, but because the Western countries didn't easily accept immigrants. In that period, the ethnic driving factor disappeared. Between 2002 and 2006, it was a growing intensity of temporary immigration as a result of decreasing cost of migration. Actually, in this period, it was easily to get a visa for the Western country, and actually, for some countries, it was not necessarily a visa, so it was much easier to be able to go out for work. After 2007, it's the year when Romania became a member of EU. So we saw a growing trend of immigration volumes. And starting with 2010, the global recession led to a decrease in the pace of immigration. I mean, as Western countries faced economical crisis, working opportunities were scarce for Romania. Well, the consequences of Romanian immigration were dramatic, I would say. Actually, the population of Romania decreased between 1992 to 2018 from 23 million to 90 million people. And these are only the official figures, because experts say that the decrease is even more important because a lot of people emigrated without legally declaring their new domicile. Now, another consequence is that immigrants are generally young. So the immigration for the 3 to 4 million people which emigrated are most of them young. So this means the share of the active population in Romania decreased dramatically, because 1 of 5 people aged 25 to 39 is actually abroad for work. And these have economic consequences. Let's say that these people pay taxes in the countries of adoption and they don't pay in Romania, and there is also a crisis on the labor market. Some fields, economic fields like constructions, face a huge lack of labor force. Another consequence is the family separation. As I said, we speak about temporary immigration, which only involves one person or one member of the family. There are also positive economic consequences, and another important consequence is that if they come back, immigrants bring know-how and modernization. The difference between Portugal and Romania is that although these two countries are the one which ranks in the two places in terms of amount of immigration, while Portugal has overcame this phase, Romania is only starting the phase or facing the highest period, the peak of the immigration. So the balance is now different shapes in Romania and in Portugal. On families, we had the effect of home alone syndrome. It means that about 350 children are left behind while their parents are going to work abroad. This means school dropping, low school participation, and absenteeism of children left alone, isolation and poor communication, and tendency to join deviant and sometimes criminal groups. Increased risk of drug use for these children, and also increased divorce ratio. Well, our case study involved 67 sociological in-depth interviews. In these interviews actually inspired the scenario of the Planet of Lost Dreams. Well, the reason of the living were, of course, economic. They have usually positive justification sometimes, and mainly this happens mainly in Portugal. In Portugal, people say smally that they go to even to improve their economic situation, while in Romania they say they immigrate because they can't no more afford their situation in Romania. The immigration is usually gradual. It means in the beginning one of the spouses goes away. After a while he or she manages to get a place to live and find some work for the other spouse, and afterwards they bring the other spouse over. It means the temporary migration is transforming in a permanent one. The advantages are economical perceived, but they always come together with emotional frustration, which affects the relationship within the family. So children have better material circumstances. They understand that immigration was a sacrifice for them to have a better life. They understand, but they don't always accept this. They have more independence, but this comes with taking more responsibilities, and sometimes separation comes as a solution to some tense situation between family members. Immigration has negative effects. Communication by phone or internet does not replace the contact or the hug, as one interviewed person said, I can see my father on the computer, but I can't hug the computer. The parent who is away is excluded from the child's stages of development. Sometimes he leaves a child, and when he comes back, he finds an adult. There is always a balance between advantages and costs. Sometimes it is accepted in advance, but when it is the case, things go less dramatically. I will pass to the conclusion. There are some important differences between Portuguese and the Romanian immigration. The modern history of Portuguese immigration started some decades earlier. It means that Portuguese immigrants managed to build a kind of culture of immigration. They managed to learn this culture, and this made them easier to support the consequences, the frustration of the immigration, because they know in advance what to expect. And this is why Portuguese immigration has more often positive justifications. For the Portuguese, the stress of the absence is mitigated by the fact that physical distance are shorter. They usually emigrate to closer countries like Spain and France. So, with globalization, the territoriality of the labor market becomes fuzzy. We cannot speak about, there is not much difference between living in Bucharest to work in Buzău or living in Bucharest to work in Portugal. Come on. The Portuguese has developed life strategies that are adapted to the way of living and a culture of immigration. Romania didn't yet. As Romania lived under a regime of total isolation until 1990, they are still under the effect of this isolation, and freedom of movement seemed to take Romanians by surprise. For a long time, going abroad for work was an extreme decision for Romanians. This is where some of the wrong judgments regarding the related cost for the immigrant and the family at home are coming from. Okay, so we can speak more after we have some more questions. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question. You mentioned the culture of immigration as something that's been developed over time in Portugal. Could you just say a bit more about that? What sort of habits or practices would be a feature of that? And do you think that will inevitably develop in a Romanian context?
Yeah. Look, in Portugal, in some of the interviews shown that migration involves sometimes several generations. I mean, the father emigrated, came back, emigrated again, came back, and then the son emigrated and his turn. So when this experience is transmitted from one generation to another, sometimes not from, it's not a case of relatives, but they know people who immigrate, know from people who had a similar experience, what to expect. So they know it in advance, and they are not so frustrated when they see on their own skin what living abroad means. They know what to expect, while Romanian people usually don't know. They maybe saw films about the life in Western countries, but they actually didn't know how it is to live as an immigrant. So the act of immigration for most of Romanian comes with very high frustration, both from the one which immigrates, as for the one which remains at home. This is why I said that Romanians actually miss a culture of immigration.
I suppose it would interest me also to see in the sociological sense what happens to Romanians or Portuguese immigrants when they go to the country where they then work, and in the current climate of confusion in Europe or globally, how their perception of being a foreigner develops when they go abroad, or how they integrate into the new, let's say, environment and perhaps bring their families, or rather prefer to go back.
Yes, actually, most of the Romanians which we interviewed said they would love to come back to their country of origin as soon as the living conditions in Romania would improve. So I would say they never really integrated there. Actually, we maybe one or two interviews shown cases which were people living in abroad really integrated in the country of adoption. But most of them, they still are, as in French there is a word, métèque, someone which does not belong to the place.
Because the intergenerational theory would imply that, let's say, Turkish immigration in Germany, that as first, second, third, fourth generation would then settle abroad. Yeah?
Yes, the dream of most Romanian immigrants is to have enough money to build a nice house back in Romania and to come back when they will be retired. And actually, if you travel in Romanian villages, you'll see a lot of new, well-looking houses, empty houses.
Actually, I conducted the interviews with the Portuguese people for this study, and you are living our second wave of immigration. Portuguese immigrants from the 50s to the 80s. My father was an immigrant, like many of them. Those have that idea, you know, to go out, to go to France, mostly Germany, some to Switzerland, and have enough money to go back. And all of them constructed a nice house to their family, so they were there alone, left behind the kids and the wife, and always came back. Those who had children there actually stayed there. They built their family there, and there are those who have children and grandchildren living there. So Romanians are starting that kind of, are not detached from Romanian culture. Portuguese are now most in several countries, and yes, they don't forget their homeland, but they actually live very well. They can live very well in other countries. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For that.
Thank you very much.
Hannes Birgner is a choreographer and the artist, and he co-directs the Design and Performance Lab at Brunel University in London, where he is Professor of Performance Technologies in the School of Arts. He has created numerous dance theater works, video installations, and digital projects in collaboration with artists in Europe, the Americas, China, and Japan, and has taught dance technology workshops in art venues across the world.
Good afternoon. Thank you again for introducing me, Marina, and thank you for having me here. I'm very honored to be back, and I'm very electrified after the lightning and thunder last night, so I think I'm still under shock from last night. And I hope this can be more of a workshop situation where I talk about some artistic ideas leading into the responses and reflections on a Planet of Lost Dreams. So I will not address Planet, although I have watched it, of course, and try to analyze it, and I hope to write about it when the time comes. But Marina asked me to provide a bit of context of the artistic developments in telematics, and I'm very happy to look back, yeah, and then look forward. So my initial idea is to think politically through this question of space that colleague Andy so beautifully and philosophically introduced, spatiality, and look at migration also in terms of how it personally perhaps affects our work as artists. Yeah? Because I'm an ex-immigrant, so to speak, still dislocated. And my essay on Planet and Other Things will be called Low-End Resilience Theory, because I'm studying at the moment how theater or art actually is participating in political responses to the crisis that seems to be ongoing and expanding. The top term of claiming is something I took from last week, an event I was invited to in Germany at Düsseldorf, where several arts organizations and theaters came together to discuss the politics of a common space. In Switzerland it was called Almende. I don't know what would be the Spanish term for a communal space, la comunidad, un espacio de comunidad, but something that is independent or owned by all, yeah? Not private and not controlled by government. So this notion of a common space, I'd like to link with the telepresence spaces. And in Düsseldorf last week, we were shown a performance work in the evening by Eric Min Company, which fascinated me, yeah?
I imagine their form while hearing them. Just like when you hear my voice. I can't see them, but I hear them constantly. I recognize them by their sound. It feels as though it's being played specially for us. All together, it becomes like music, like a symphony.
فكرت حامل سلاح وبعدها ما لقينا جثة.
So this was my first witnessing of a drone performance, In part 2, they switched to Gaza. And the images that they integrate in the dance are the drone camera images of rooftops in Gaza, where some of the Palestinian dancers were doing a parkour and dancing through the rubble of the rooftops. It was rehearsed in Lebanon, in Beirut, and they studied drone manipulation in Beirut and then assembled the piece. My keywords today are this notion of, is there such a thing as a common space, and can we reconquer some space of creativity even when you are, in a sense, controlled by agencies that are above you or that are looking at you and your output. This involves censorship or even the possibility of creation, and also access to technologies to create, and then having a platform to show. Interactivity is something that comes out of the technological world of processing, and for me, performance techniques is now that conjunction of creativity and technology. The notion of a third space goes back to the post-colonial discourse of also resisting first world, in our case perhaps it's the Euro-American history of theater and its colonial past. Yeah? So I just bring it up because common space for me in the political sense is also a counter space, a counter public. And I will end with just my sense of where things are going wrong in Europe, terribly wrong, because I think we are in a moment of huge crisis. Won't even mention Brexit, but I think it's the rise of right-wing populisms and nationalisms and homophobia and xenophobia, which will make migration a very, very difficult subject, economically, but also, of course, politically. So the Germans last week assumed that common places now is also a challenge through the technologies that are infiltrating our daily habits and behaviors. So that the internet and smartphones are now tools that affect our human existence. Create possibilities, but also close down, I think, what our colleague referred to as the hug. The hug, the actual face-to-face human intimate relations. So there are economic and scientific questions in the corporate world also, think of Amazon and so on, that will overshadow our creativities because we are being co-opted. How does digital culture then create a platform for us, for conditions of production? Yeah? And I then thought, okay, I look back. As a choreographer working in dance and technology, I was always interested in new tools. So when we would go into the studio, we would look at cameras, sound equipment, software that became available. And then when in 2000, I was in Columbus, Ohio, they said to me, would you like to do telematics? I said yes. And I didn't even know what it was. And it then became a question of finding partners, and we were 5 partners, and then 7, and then 9 in the United States, in Japan, and in Brazil. And we started to just explore, and I then began to write about it, although I didn't really know yet what was new, because I think working on camera, the actors will confirm, working on camera is slightly different in a real-time situation than just being in film or television. And so I think we started with very ancient things like see you, see me, I don't know, I visit, what all these things were called, yeah, to bring up the different sites and also have a chat line running at the same time. This is Corpus Informaticos in Brazil. So we are filming, we're moving, we're doing sexy things, yeah, mostly images that we generated from the body. Because the camera is either on the body or on objects, and the body in a sense becomes an image that you send to the other sites, and so it's image making in a way for me as a movement artist. So I didn't really use text or dramatic script, but we're working on images and transmission. And so it's very clunky, but look at this example in 2001. We're sending a voice and a movement to several locations. And the camera person wants to capture something that is of interest. I think it became her hand, yeah? Her body and hand entering into other spaces. And the other space was sent to us from the partner. Staircase. So in a way you could say she's trying to walk up that staircase, or imagining walking up the staircase, touching the space that's not there. Bending into a space that's not there. In a way, we're requiring the performer to invent possibilities of interacting with spatial images in the moment, because it's all improvised. We never really scripted, except in that Birdman piece I had a small poetic text like a loop that all sides were to interpret in their own way. And it was a text by Vito Anconci. Am I talking too fast? I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
And I'm realizing I don't speak Romanian. With my Spanish friends, we can look at issues, but if you need translation, please slow me down. I wanted to show this as a test of the improvisation of camera actor and the importance of, in a way, that collaboration, yeah? And so in a way, the camera team and the sound team, the people on the mixing board, are in real time fusing what's coming in from the different sides. And in a way, the actors will have to look at the image, or have to be aware where the camera is, or perform into the camera. I think, Andrea, you did it all the time, right?
Yeah.
So you have to know the space of the camera. You have to know, now I'm outside of the frame, yeah. And also then, of course, the camera person interacts, so does the mixer, yeah. And that creates a sense of interesting togetherness. Second example is very different. Now we're switching forward into more recent time. A friend in France, Annie Abrahams, has come up with these performances that she calls distant feeling. She invites people, yeah, we meet at a platform, we close our eyes. And I'm not asking you to repeat this with me, but I'd like you to patiently perhaps experience performing together, not seeing each other, but feeling perhaps a sense of that imaginary togetherness. And when we asked people afterwards, what is it like to share that moment of present distance, it was very interesting to hear people talk about it. Yeah, what is this space that we're creating? Is it something that also happens mostly internally, inside us, yeah? So that the perception is, when you close your eyes, not about images and technology and all the apparatus, but feel your way being together with someone else whom you can maybe only hear or you imagine. Annie Abrahams asked us at some point to move closer to the camera or to move our hands forward. Then she asks us to lean backwards. And you also begin to explore this sense of alignment and disalignment in that limited space. I found it very beautiful, and also it was introspective for me to imagine not seeing that there are other people in the same networked company that I have established. My last example, I attended rehearsal of a company that also collaborated with artists in occupied territory in Palestine. This is the London Station House Opera, and a dancer that I've worked with for many years, Yoko Ishiguro, with a Palestinian actor, Al-Meshal. And the technique that they use is video streaming that is mixed to the audience on either side, appear then on screen a composite image similar to perhaps Planet of Lost Dreams, except they have a very disturbing tendency to explore the blending of images. So I wanted to show this. This is the studio setup. I'm in London. The actress in the background, this is the Lebanese director Tagrid, working with Maynard Smith. She's getting ready to be on this table, which will be a bed in Gaza, and they're getting ready to beam her over into the scene with her nephew, who's in Palestine. And this scene is then enacted together where the young guy in the hood sits on the bed and she is visiting the family sitting on the sofa. Yeah? So the company in London who was funded to do this by the Arts Council said it's primarily about the people in Gaza and their inability to perhaps travel, and also this is not a technical issue but a cultural issue. There were issues with gender. Women were not really supposed to be performing without veil. Also at 9 o'clock the electricity was shut off, so rehearsals had to end at a certain time. And of course there was the language issue, English, Arabic, yeah? Constant translation, perhaps in your case Spanish, Romanian, you had your translator there. I find this fascinating. Here's an example of the blending technique. For me, it's haunting and disturbing, and I'm not sure that I fully understand the artistic concept here. So let's look at a brief clip from the blending.
Imagine a vast green land, very big. That's where it happened. Lots of tents, several big ones, and then many smaller ones in the camps where the people were staying. There's so many people, it was so loud, and everywhere you go there's loads of people coming in and out of the tents, and you pass everywhere and you can hear there's music everywhere, people are wearing weird clothes and costumes, and I don't know, like Snow White, policemen, nurses, pumpkins, giraffes, beetles, bottles.
The disturbing noise outside is actually jackhammers. There was construction going on next to Battersea Park, so they're rehearsing the monologue or the dialogue while there is a jackhammer outside. And what I find interesting, looking back to my early work 20 years ago, the dancer in the space. Look at the next scene, because the dancer is having to work with the camera, obviously. So this is the actress in London. She will do a duet with the actor in Gaza. She's looking at the camera, and underneath the camera they have a monitor. So she can check where she is in the frame and so can the actor in Gaza. Yeah? It's an improvisation. It was meant to be an intimate duet between a young man and a young woman. The young man in Gaza was handicapped. He had only one arm. It was really moving and very beautiful to see how they negotiated this space.
By the way, I had an idea. You say you don't have people on either side, walk across the room, sit down.
Well, then you have to look at the screen, obviously, to see the other side, and we can discuss this later on, this relationship of real space to the projected space, and what that does for both the performers and the audience. So I will wrap up. I wanted to end by saying now we would have to begin to look at the politics again of these kind of performances. I don't think it's true that the London company working with artists in Gaza opens any window for them except that possibility of working in Telepresence, but of course it does not contest the physical-political relation. It is hopeless to actually contest political control through art, and therefore for me Telepresence is not really going anywhere, I think, politically, but it's a window. And if we're now expanding it into VR, this is from last year, Bucharest, my workshop here with VR, I was of course fascinated that the participants here at the National Dance Center were willing to go with me into this virtual forest and imagine being in a forest when there was no forest. So we did hang some things up there so that there would be an augmented reality, a sort of a forest that was abstracted. And then in the VR world, you are making a fake world, yeah? A simulacrum. And maybe, Andy, we need to come back to this issue of what kind of a world is this? And in terms of migration and the political existential experience of disintegration, divorce, or unhappiness, or the daughter missing her mother, yeah? If you cannot touch something or understand the dialogue as it really affects your living condition, I'm not sure how we as artists can play with that. The director of the Institute said that technologies are there to play, yeah, but they're also playing with us, and they are, in a sense, creating conditions that we need to adopt. I end here. I'm working now with VR, and again, it's hopeless. I can't have 100 or 200 people come, and I have one goggle set, and then everyone has to wait until it's their turn to go into the VR world, yeah? It's not a proposition, I think, that's realistic for an audience, unless you come up with new ideas how to let audiences actually intervene into the image-making process, into the virtual compositions. So in other words, politically speaking, the common space is always physical, I think, and it's concrete. And working with media then opens new and difficult challenges, and they are all technical also. They are all technical challenges because to make something that is perhaps provocative or resisting control, you need to understand how you can resist through the technology. Thank you very much.
Technology through which they screened the performer who was in Gaza seemed a little bit like a holographic presence. Is there anything related to that, or can you explain?
Well, in the London, this is I think better seen. In the London performance, the audience was seated where you are. Here was the setup, 2 camera sets. And there was the screen, so we had to look between actor and screen, and the video mixing people, the video mixers, they blend the combined image to create the third space on screen. So we're always watching, I think, in Telepresence, the generator, the actor generator, the dancer generator, the musician, and then if you are fusing, this is London, this is Gaza, you need to fuse them on a screen. It becomes a pale projection. Sometimes maybe if you have good projections it's good, but here it looks already slightly diffused and weaker, yeah? And so the third space is a composite. Yeah, and for me, this compositeness is so clunky. Well, of course you can become good at compositing, and I think Planet of Lost Dreams did a very good job, I think, in using small cameras and how you mixed, and also the Kinect scene. I think it's a huge challenge how to then introduce another system on top of the video conferencing system, namely the Kinect camera, yeah, which is with the Google tilt brush or with some of the simple interventions. It's creating a playful way of drawing, yeah, and that you need to then make work for you narratively or abstractly or poetically or painterly. Yeah? So in a sense, you are compositing. You're composing with an image medium, it's a spatial medium. Andy, wouldn't you say? Images?
Of course.
Yeah. Unless you, as we did in the previous example, take out the central eye thing and focus perhaps more on the auditory, and perhaps introduce other ways of touching across distance, yeah? I remember in some of my early work, when we were really newcomers, we were doing a lot of hand pieces, yeah? That always had to do with touching. Seeking to touch through, yeah? To the other side, which is ridiculous, you know, because you can't feel it really. I mean, do you feel a touch on Skype? When you kiss someone? No, you don't.
I don't understand well the setup or the set of this particular scene. So there was a person, the woman, that people actually see in the...
Yeah, she sits in London on a bench. The bench has to have the same height as
yes.
the sofa in Gaza.
Yes, yes.
And then she, sitting on the bench in London, is appearing on the sofa in Gaza.
Yes.
That's a real bed and a real sofa in Gaza.
Okay. But the people in London, there is an audience to see the woman. If in London,
yeah.
There is an audience.
There's an audience in London and an audience in Gaza.
Okay.
And so the audience in Gaza sees the young nephew. The audience in London sees the aunt, yeah? And in the case of the dancers, they see the young woman in London dancing to the camera, and the boy in Gaza dances with her.
And the performance consists in
on the
see
screen?
The woman and see the screen.
Yeah, together. Yeah.
That blend. Okay.
So together they only come in virtual reality. And therefore I think I asked myself, can the Gaza artists imagine themselves in London? And I think this is the difficulty, because I think they can't. Yeah? And can the London people understand the gender, religious and political pressure under which the artists in Gaza are working? No, they can't. Yeah? So this is, I think, where the link becomes for me very unequal. And I think the producing body also was London, yeah, not Gaza. So I think the rhetoric is misleading when it's said that we can occupy each other's homes and streets. No, we can't, yeah? Because I don't know what it was like to be in Lebanon during the war, yeah? Or in Sarajevo, for that matter, yeah? Because we heard about snipers in Sarajevo, but to make a telepresence connection to Sarajevo is pointless, I think. In fact, the Sarajevo friends I had, they were publishing a cookbook, how to cook under occupation and war. I think that's an interesting gesture of resistance. Do you remember that cookbook? No? Okay. 1992. So you see the compositional question that you address, is also, of course, an artistic question. Yeah. So in a way, you're composing with new technologies that And you said your script tried to include the technology as an actor, but it's even more than an actor. It's the apparatus, it's the conditions of your possibility if you are broadcasting, if you're streaming. Yeah? So we, of course, we love the technical breakdowns. Someone said there's a problem. It's not a problem. I think when glitches appear, it becomes more interesting. Yeah? At least I think I learned a lot from when the audio suddenly was changing and when the image suddenly fell apart, because that's what sonic artists do with software, yeah? With granular synthesis. They break down the image into tiny, tiny digital blocks, yeah? And then redistribute it. So we only spoke largely about interaction between performers. But there are other forms of telepresence that link softwares, yeah? And software processes, where you can create composite images that are generated by software, which is also interesting. And the question is, of course, is there an audience for this that would really want to look 90 minutes at that kind of telepresence performance? I mean, we can maybe talk about this. How was your experience of the dissemination? In London, the performance was done 3 times, and I think because it has a political subtext, people came to see what was Station House Opera doing. And apparently on the 3rd night, all technical systems failed. Which again is fascinating to me when the presumed connectivity disintegrates. And I think this is the political scenario right now in Europe. It's disintegrating. It does not look so good.
Javier has a BA from Escuela Superior de Arte Dramatico in Murcia and an MA in Cultural Management by the Universidad de Católica. He is the director from Spain. We collaborated with him. He directed the stand side of the performance in permanent interaction with us.
Could we state, as Peter Brook has, that theatre today is still someone walking across an empty space while someone else is watching them? No doubt, theatre has the simplicity of a specific moment, on an instance of performance that can be summed in Vittorio Gassman's words as someone who pretends to be who he is not, and someone who pretends that what they are watching is real. The poor theatre that Grotowski stood for is today equally necessary, see indeed, inside at its actual core, performance is nothing more than actor and audience. And that is where the foundation in communication lies. Over the course of theatre tradition, we have fought in order to defend theatre's ability to summon art and remind an art that is coupled with integrating all other in a single space within the same time unit. Architecture and painting for space design, poetry for drama, and so on and so forth until the field comes into being. The rise of a new expressive art, such as the 7th Force has led to the millenary art of performance that will be eventually bring about the death of theatre. For others, like us, it was an opportunity for integrating an element that was as powerful as it was expressive and had a great capacity to create meaning. The game in which we engage the audience during a performance involves a number of different dimensions, such as the ludic, reflexive, and participatory ones. But if we were to synthesize a performance, is place, time, and space. Considering multi-space as a place where theatre can happen, the audience will be able to live without ever moving from their seat. A duplication of the stage in real time and space, only thousands of kilometers away, through a projection screen that presents a mixed scene. This new window implies a multiplication of the stage and the space. Tele-Encounters, through the planet of lost dreams, leave the door open for a game of space and time, such as always has been the case with theater, only with a new dimension that now brings the Iter-Nuke criterion on which we had previously relied in order to determine the quiescence of theater. With regard to time in drama, we will feel distinguished between stage time and dramatic time, and she agrees with Pavis by defining the stage time as the time the audience lives, as opposed to the time of the story that evolves within a continuous present. Dramatic time is therefore the time of the fiction, of the illusion, that contains not only the events that are performed on the stage. And this is where one of the initial games appear, which we come across as we maintain two spaces and a single stage time. But what time does the audience live? According to the reception criterion, the here and now must be lived in present physically, with no intermediation whatsoever between the actor and the audience members, who share that very space and time. In this case, there is a window open through which actions occur in a continuous now, but that optically relates to very clearly separate space, which, thanks to technology and the audiovisual as an independent language in itself, can now be brought together for the audience as a mixed reality for theater and television. As a different from film, the language of television is live transmission. The audience is conscious that everything they see is happening simultaneously in a separate place. At least that is the purpose with which television is born, that of broadcasting its images in a continuous time. Film, on the other hand, focuses its language on the richness of editing and the post-production of previously shot material meant to be exhibited at later date. Adding recorded television material or rebroadcasting events will cause the audience to doubt whether what they are watching has the veracity that can only be based upon by the concept of live transmission. As for the narrative ability of audiovisual editing, the present possibility of live editing adds a special rhythm, stylistic and discursive richness, offering a new combined scene to the stage. Even so, the projection of image on a stage maintains an element of Brechtian's estrangement over the audience. Analyzing this new dichotomy, we can discuss two terms, veracity and verisimilitude, that which the audience is willing to believe as true, and on the other hand, the issue of consciousness. The audience needs to be aware that what they are saying is actually occurring. Theater cannot conceal this second issue, that of consciousness. There is a live performance that shares that same time and space going on in front of the audience. Directly related to this basic aspect of theater is the verisimilitude. Once have questioned the degree of reality of what is happening on the other side of the screen. Presenting the planet of lost dreams on a stage means taking one determining aspect into account. Upon entering the room, the audience was briefed minutes before the show on the singularity of the project they were going to attend. In this introduction, they were announced that through European Union Foundation program, thank you very much, the text has been read based on real testimonies of Romanian migrants in Spain and Romania, and that the performance will take place in 2 theater venues at the same time. The other side will be presented by means of a real-time projection on the screen that was a part of the scenography. This previous condition secures a conscious reception on the part of the audience attending a telematic theater show once they are convinced right before the show that on top of everything else they share of the fact of being an audience with an extension of the performance that is going on at the other end of Europe. The correct reception of this performance is therefore subject to the condition that the audience are familiar with its aspect. It's a common element in all arts since we have to attend the contract of fiction in full consciousness, convinced that we are watching a fake reality, that we accept to believe. But in this case, have the audience suppose this reality would only make make them lose part of the meaning. The fiction in this show also requires an element of the reality that the public must know about. Some of the audience members confessed it, or once the performance has finalized, that during the show they had doubted whether the projection they were looking at had been previously recorded. Some of them only were convinced upon seeing the actor bomb in front of the Romanian audience. We must conclude by bringing for the need for a conscious audience, ready for a new type of theater that is open to technology as a part of the performance, one that will connect several space and audience. The implementation of technological revolution in the performing arts has always been a constant, and future should not impose barriers to the adoption of new ways of communicating and performing, as long as the basic coordinates of the stage are maintained. More specifically, a shared presence of actor and audience will always be required. The exploration of distance and telecommunication within the family immigration situation that Tele-Encounters suppose has caused us to both reflect on and research new technology and the way the distance can become less to given the present channels of communication. This relationship between telecommunication and performing arts is what brought true value to our work and has made a performance possible that take place on 2 stages at the same time. A performance that will open the door for a multi-venue system that makes one envision multidisciplinary shows where the limits are overthrown by technology. In my opinion, for concluding, the utility of this project is defined in the opportunities it provides, in the coming together of separate groups of work who share a clear purpose, in the coordination of several dozens of people who work towards a common goal, in the performing and artistic possibilities which it will enable. We may have contradicted the concept of poor theater that Grotowski advocated for. No doubt, theater needs less devices. In this performance of telematic theater, we have connected many cables, many devices, maybe in order to leave theater behind and do something else, something different, even with a different name. Crossing the stage limits in order to connect new audience to new stage and audiovisual experience. But there is no doubt that theater is the perfect place to try involving all arts, and that it could be precisely the art of theater. the one that can bring Europe a bit closer. Thank you, Marina, for all. Thank you, company, for this experience. Thank you.